Hi, I'm Gary Stearman of Prophecy Watchers, and today I'm talking with Michael Gagliardi. And he is a gentleman with whom I've had a long conversation prior to this, and I have really been impressed by his message. Michael, welcome to Prophecy Watchers. Good to see you.
Thank you for having me. It's a warm day here in the Coachella Valley. It's 110 degrees. I don't
Wow,
know where you guys are, but I'm sure it's cooler.
110 degrees. Well, at least you don't have to have any artificial heat. That you've got all the heat you need.
Right.
Michael, you have a story that I want you to share, and I'd like to chat with you during the time that you're sharing this, because we we take, I think, this world for granted. I think human beings doing their daily thing tend to take uh, coming and going, eating breakfast, eating supper, sleeping, and if by some chance we go to church, and if we get saved in the vernacular, then we go to church on Sunday and everything is just fine. And that's kind of the view that people have of Christianity. Talking to you, you get an entirely different view. In fact, in your early childhood, you grew up with a firsthand knowledge that this world is not just all sweetness and light, and it's not all just going to church and coming home and making money. Uh, there's a deeper and darker aspect to life. And let's start right there and talk about where you came from and how you grew up.
Well, I grew up in the Toronto area in Ontario, Canada. I was born in Etobicoke, which is one of the boroughs. It's just like New York. We have boroughs in Ontario, just like they have in New York, the Bronx and stuff like that. I grew up in Etobicoke, and basically what my whole story is about is that my mother's father, who she dearly loved, with her sister and her brother, he died a tragic death, being killed by a train. And my mother and her sister took solace in seances to speak, to grab a hold of, to connect with her father, who they adored.
So she was looking for answers.
She was looking for answers. Her father, she adored her father. She lost him tragically, and they tried very hard to connect with him in the spirit realm, and that's what kind of opened the doorway to the demonic forces that came into our family. And apparently, this started before I was born, and when I was about 3 years old, insidious things started happening in our house. My mother started hearing voices, hearing scratchings in the walls and knockings, and I believe at that time she was still involved with seances with her sister, because her sister was an occultist for a number of years, and that began the path of the demonic oppression until years later. It never stopped until it was full possession. And we moved from Toronto into a small town in northern Ontario, Canada. I'm really not sure why, but we were isolated in this tiny town. And that's when things began to escalate and get really, really bad.
Well, as you begin the story, and by the way, stick with this because his story has a wonderful conclusion, and I think it's a conclusion that we all need to hear and think about. But so far, what you're telling me is demons are real. In other
Yeah,
words,
yeah.
they are real, and they're nobody you really want to be close to, right?
Yes, I had 12-year close firsthand experience with my mother speaking in different languages, in different voices, abusing herself, um, uh, the list is without going into details, is very horrific. And I suffered great PTSD even to this day. I have severe PTSD that I deal with.
And
Really
at the height of this, how old were you?
Well, it started around 3 when I started noticing things, and my sister's 7 years older, so she noticed it before. And by the time I was 16, it was really, really bad. And then eventually at 19, I had to leave the country to put it all behind me to start afresh and anew.
Now, here you are. This is kind of the crux of the story. You are living a life of torment, and you and your sister are seeing things that most people never see. But this is an absolute reality for you. And what we're talking about, folks, is salvation. I mean, when I hear Michael's story, running through my mind at all times is the idea of salvation. And then my secondary thought, Michael, is that people think of salvation as kind of a neutral event. You maybe walk to the front of a chapel, or however you do it, or you might sit with a pastor and you pray together, and then a little bit later you're baptized, and that is that. And that's as deep as you ever get into, shall we say, the spiritual battle that is going on planet Earth. You came through a back door, so to speak. The first thing you ever saw was the darkness. And to me, that's the value of your story. So let's continue on there.
Well, the thing that really had an impact on me, despite what was going on my mother, even at an early age, was that I realized that I couldn't trust my mother and my father at a very young age. My father was never home, and my mother was going through this thing. She never kissed me. She never coddled me. She never held me. There was no affection whatsoever. I was just existing as this little boy. And so I learned at a very young age not to trust anyone. And the Lord knew that if you can't trust your parents, you can't trust anybody. I mean, if they brought you in this world and they spend their time making money and building a home for you and security and safety and all these things that your friends don't do, I mean, they're the epitome of care and nurturing in your life. And when you don't have that, everyone else just falls miserably off that cliff of you understanding that you can't trust them. So the Lord knew I wasn't going to trust anyone. So he said, okay, I guess this is how I'm going to have to reach you. And many years later, after I left the country, I was 19 years old. I left the country, and my wife and I, we got married at a very young age. We were 19 and 18 years old. And we started fighting a lot. And, part of the reason why we're fighting a lot is that I had severe PTSD symptoms and didn't even know it. Didn't know why I felt like I felt, why I acted like I acted, and how I perceived life, because everybody was maligned in my perspective, and no one was really righteous or true, because that came from my parents. So my wife and I ended up separating, and a couple of weeks after we separated, she told me that she was pregnant. And when I found that out, I was absolutely devastated. And I didn't want to be one of those guys that wasn't going to be around for his child. And, I was like, what am I doing? And for the next few weeks, I felt the brevity, the weight of my sin. And, I didn't call it sin, but I felt the pressure of this situation that I was able to fix. But I created it in a sense. And it was so heavy on my heart that I just couldn't.
Now, at
I
that
could,
point, let me just cut in and in the I guess the story of your salvation. Where are you at this point when all this is happening that you're talking about? You're not saved at this point.
yes, and at 19 years old, 18 years old, I had moved to California. I left Canada. I was from the Toronto area, and I said, I need a new start. I need to get out of here. And I was homeless on the Santa Monica Pier. I was living under the Santa Monica Pier. The only reason why I went there is because we didn't have internet in those days. And one of my favorite shows was Three's Company, and the trailer, the intro for Three's Company was on the Santa Monica Pier. And I used to watch that and go, I'm going to go there. That's real. That place is real. So I hopped on a bus. There's more details to the story because I actually got rejected at the customs, and I had to kind of sneak across,
Okay.
which was a mess. But I got rejected, and I came to California, and I was sleeping under the Santa Monica Pier. And 12 days later, I met my wife. So God had this thing all planned out, you know. And it was after I had met my wife, we ended up, you know, getting married at, you know, the same within a year. And, you know, we started fighting because I really never knew anything about relationships. I didn't know how to do a relationship. I was pretty inept to socialization. I mean, back then I couldn't even talk on the phone. My wife would have to make phone calls for me, and I was a musician trying to get in a band. She'd make the phone calls for me because I just couldn't socially adapt. I had no social skills. So after we started fighting, we broke up. And like I said before, you know, I found out she was pregnant. And, you know, within 2 weeks, I was, as a human being, I was feeling the full weight of what I know now is the of sin in my life. And I was so heavy that one day when I was going to see her, I gave her I had such terrible guilt. I gave her my truck, I gave her my money, I gave her everything. But one day on a bus, because I gave her my truck, I was going down Ventura Boulevard, and I was right in front of Taft High School, and I couldn't bear it no more. And I cried right there in front of probably 40 or 50 people on that bus. They were all looking at me. I couldn't care less. I was just so distraught. And I surrendered myself. I said, Lord, whoever you are, because I didn't know who God was, but I knew that there was a creator. There had to be. I just wasn't following or searching at that point. And I asked him, I said, Lord, whoever you are, forgive me for what I've done. I've made a mess of my life. And, you know, I'm not going to say I heard a voice. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't see anything, but I felt this amazing wave of joy, of happiness, and a sense of peace that it's going to be okay. And from looking out the window to the minute that happened, when I turned around, I was able to see the people on that bus and the world. It's the veil had lifted. And it wasn't until months later when I went to church that I found out these terms and these explanations for these terms, that the veil had been lifted, and now I was able to see the world as it was. Anyway, I was so filled with joy at that moment. People probably thought I was crazy. I was crying 1 minute, and then I had a smile on my face. And
Wow.
when I got to my destination, I got off the bus and I ran to my old house, and I knocked on the door, and my wife answered the door. And I said, you're not going to believe what happened to me on this bus. I don't even know what happened to me, but something wonderful happened to me. And she let me in. She was kind of apprehensive. And I sat her down on the couch, and I said, listen, something just happened to me, and I don't even know what it was, but I've got to tell you, it's going to be okay. And I want to get back together again, and we're going to do this thing right. We're going to stay married. We're going to have this child, and we're going to do things right. And I still had no idea what had happened to me.
You really, at this point, didn't know what right was.
Yeah, I had no idea what had happened to me.
Well, let me recap just a second. Back in the
Sure.
70s and 80s, you started out in northern Ontario
Yes.
in a terrible family situation.
Yes.
Your family, your mom, possessed. We talked about that, and you finally fled and came to California, and then the thing happened to you that we have just heard about. And so that sort of recaps. Uh, I'd like to go back to the very beginning, and you shared something with me in another conversation about the spiritual status where you grew up, the status of society in Ontario and around Winnipeg and places like that. That they are not unfamiliar with the dark side up there, and you grew up in that, if you will, in that environment.
Yes. If you do some research about the Niagara area, the St. Catharines area, all up through Ontario into Toronto, into Petersburg, you will find out that there's a heavy presence of mounds, just like they have in Ohio. So we know, just like Abraham Lincoln said about the Niagara Falls, that the giants, their eyes gazed upon the Niagara Falls. So we know that that whole area of southern Ontario was a Nephilim breeding ground, and it's very dark. It's very dark. I mean, growing up as a kid, we would find these abandoned houses, out in the country, and we'd visit these homes. You know, you're kids, you're 12, you're 13, you're adventurous, you're ambitious. We'd go into these houses and we'd find pentagrams on the ground, and animal sacrifices. Sometimes the animals would still be there, and that was back then, and it was, we would always hear stories about covens in the woods, deep in the woods, and things like that. So Ontario in the Niagara region is a very dark place. It's extremely territorial by spiritual nature. There are definitely principalities ruling over those areas. In fact, the little town that I grew up in, after doing some research over the last 10 years, 90% of all the movies that are filmed in that area are horror movies.
Hmm.
There's been cannibalistic movies that have been filmed there.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of demonic movies, and movies including the devil in the title, which is fascinating. So, when you do your research about that, you understand that these entities have dominion over these areas. There are certain areas that they hold on to, and when people move into those areas, the darkness is there. The darkness is there.
And you shared with me in a previous conversation that there are the little people in the woods. There are things like that people talk about up there, and that's sort of the environment where you grew up.
Yes, yeah. I've never heard it that much in the United States, but there's a lot of information out there about these little people from Ontario all the way to Vancouver, from 6 inches tall to about 2 feet, 2.5 feet. And my mother would often say, this was in the beginning of the oppression, that she would see little people running around our house. And we happened to get a cat a couple of years later, and she wanted to kill the cat because she said that the cat was eating the little people. She would see their feet dangling from her mouth. And it's very strange. And I've done a lot of studies on the little people, and you see a lot of that in the areas of Ontario all the way to Vancouver, mostly in Canada.
The reason I wanted to talk about this is because that's the world. You talk about the world, and wherever you go around the world, there are backgrounds, if you will. Of course, in the Middle East, the Far East, you find all kinds of superstitions, so-called, that feature various demonological ideologies and strange creatures, and you see this like in India and the Near East and the Far East, and then in Canada. and then in other places that we could talk about. But what I wanted to do was kind of set the scene for what became a spectacular salvation, the one that happened to you. And that's where we left off on the story. And the story is you went home, you told your wife, look, something has happened. Let's begin from there, and let's talk about the born again experience as you saw it at that time.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and when I look back at it today, I'm fascinated by it, even though it happened to me. Um, the days after actually getting saved, I would tell my wife that. So we got to back together 2 weeks later. After I got off the bus, we made plans to get back together 2 weeks later.
You
I had
received
to wrap
Christ
up
on a
before I was
bus,
dead.
sitting on a bus. You broke into
Yes.
tears in front of 50 people.
Yeah.
You got off the bus. You were a changed person, but you really didn't know how you were changed at this point.
I had no idea. I just kept telling my wife, something happened to me, and I'm not the same person anymore. So I started getting really thirsty for the Lord. And still at that point, I didn't know who the Lord was. So I rented Franco Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth,
Ah, yes.
hoping that, wow, let me search into this. Who is this Lord that I feel like I've just met? Anyway, I was watching the movie, and my wife was cooking or washing dishes in the kitchen. And the phrase came, it's a red letter movie where Jesus says the red letters like in the Bible. So, and he comes to the part where he says, my sheep know my voice.
Uh-huh.
They hear me and they know my voice. And I stood back on my chair and I told Sherry, come in here, come in here. She ran into the room. She thought there was something wrong. And I pointed at the TV and I said, that's who I met on the bus. I said, I did not hear an audible voice, but his voice is who I heard. And she kind of looked at me like, okay, and, I was convinced. I was convinced that that's who spoke to me on the bus. That's who I met on the bus. And my thirst for God, once again, still I didn't know. I got to point now at Jesus, because that's whose voice I identified. And then I asked a friend of mine, where can we go to church? And he goes, well, we go to church at Rocky Peak in Simi Valley. So I told Sherry, okay, next Sunday we're going. We went there. We're sitting there, and the pastor starts giving a sermon about being born again.
Uh-huh.
And when he got to the part with Nicodemus, and Jesus said, you must be born again. That's when I put 2 and 2 together. And I turned to my wife and I said, this is what happened to me. This is what happened to me on the bus. I was born again. Even though I didn't even know, that was the first time I heard the terminology, I knew that born again is what happened to me, that I was born again in the Spirit. Because I kept telling her, I'm a new man. I'm not the man I used to be, and I can't explain it to you.
And nobody came to you and witnessed to you and said, you must be born again, and talked about all the aspects of salvation. Nobody led you to Christ. This is truly amazing. I mean, it's the grace of God in action. And
Yes.
that's why I love to talk to you, because the story starts in darkness and in difficulty and in, I suppose you could say, hopelessness. Where do I go from here? And it ends with the love of Jesus. And, in 1 John, twice John says, God is love. In other words, he uses the little 3-word sentence. God is love, period. That's the end of that sentence. And the first time I ever saw that in the Bible, I thought, that's spectacular. The creator of the heavens and the earth and the ruler of the universe and the Son of God and God incarnate and the Holy Spirit. But it all boils down to God is love. And your story reminds me of that.
Yes. Well, I wasn't able to see right away that it was love for me, because I never experienced love. My mother never held me. She never touched me. She never kissed me. I didn't know what love was until once again, being fed by God's word, he says that he died on the cross. Though we were yet sinners, he died for us because he loved us. And I had to put this whole thing together. It was like a mystery to me. And I said, he did it for me. He chased me down because he loved me. And that was the very first time where I felt love. Somebody loves me. I was like blown away by that. And the only person where I actually saw love being on display was my wife. But the first time I felt love was when I was born again. And it was part of that experience that I didn't know how. I didn't know. See, that's what made me feel okay and safe and that I had peace, is because I was loved, which I had never experienced before.
Now,
so that was the great joy of
well,
it.
it is great joy. Yeah, and when I hear your story, I can also hear somebody out there maybe listening to us right now saying, I'm not sure that I believe any of this story at all. And furthermore, why doesn't God love me?
Yes.
There's somebody out there who is in great distress, who is in a situation that seems unresolvable. And they're saying, if God is love, it certainly doesn't appear that way to me. What would you say to that person?
Well, I did feel like that. I did feel like that. But what changed it is that I came before the throne and I surrendered and I bowed my head. See, that was the thing that changed it, because I would have remained in that heavy laden, heavy burdened situation that had no escape. But because I came to Christ in humbleness, in humility, and like a child, and I cried before him, not because I wanted some sort of resolution, but I knew that I was sinful. It made me recognize my sin. And we cannot come to Jesus unless we recognize that we are sinful, because we have no need for Christ if we don't understand that we're sinful. As soon as you figure that out, that, oh my gosh, I'm a sinful person. And I was feeling the brevity of that the whole time. That's why I knew I had to go to someone who is higher than me to help me, and that's why I cried out to him. And I cried out to him in humbleness, and I surrendered. Like I said, I was so distraught that I cried in front of 40 or 50 people, and they were all looking at me, and I couldn't care less what they thought. I just knew that this was the end for me. I was either going to kill myself, or, the options were not good. So I had nothing to lose. And I think that's where most people, they don't get to. Like, I know people that said that they've prayed for this in their life, and had, take the yearning for alcohol and things like that. They just want him to come and take that away. They don't want to surrender before him. See, you can't put the cart before the horse. You got to have Jesus first before he comes into your heart and then works the heart. You can't ask for the heart to be changed and then say, well, then I'll ask Jesus. Then I'll come to Jesus. Show me first what you can do. So that was the difference. And I think that's the difference with all humanity, is that you got to come to him first.
Indeed. And I was looking at 1 Corinthians as you're talking here, and 1 Corinthians 1:21 says, For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save men, to save them that believe. In other words, the wisdom of God is regarded by people on earth as foolishness.
Yes.
And contrasting that with that day on the bus when you came sort of to a crisis, and suddenly the word foolishness just didn't have any more meaning for you.
Yes. Yes.
But
I had run out.
But I know
Wow.
you and I both know that a lot of people, when they hear anything about Christianity, they think of it in a formalized fashion, and then they look at their watch and say, "Oh, time to go. I can't. I don't have time to listen to this. See you later." And because in their minds, the formulaic idea of Christianity is something that you can listen to, or you can just walk away. And that's sort of the way the world looks at the gospel. You take the gospel a step further on the bus, and the scene on the bus will never leave my mind. You're back there, you're crying. Something is terribly wrong. This is the culmination of many, many years. And the word foolishness is the farthest thing from your mind at that point, right?
Yes, I was deplete of solutions, deplete of myself, and I knew that that the world's solutions were not any for me. And I had to go beyond that. And I think that's what most people have to realize. I think most people do come to Christ honestly when they're shattered, when they're thrown on the ground and shattered into a million pieces. Because, unless we render ourselves like children before him, which is what I did. I mean, children cry in front of people and they don't care, right? That's what they do. They cry in restaurants. They don't care whether people are looking at them.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most humble stance that you can take is to cry for Jesus. But you have to be led there. You have to be led there. And this is what Christ does. He allows you to go through your sin until you recognize that it's unbearable. Because we cannot see or come to Christ without knowing that you have a sin problem. There is no way of getting around that. You cannot avert, the obstacle of sin to come to Jesus and expect something to change in your life without dealing with the sin. That is the issue. And until a person is completely burdened by that sin and feels the guilt and the contrition of it, you can't approach him. You can't approach him. That's why God is a holy God. He needs you empty so that he can fill you up.
Paul talks about this, reading again in 1 Corinthians, that he says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than man. And the thing about this is that, and I'm thinking of the world today, not just the scene of you on the bus and the background in Canada, but I'm thinking of the world today and the pervasive quality of sin, this foolishness is just covering the planet. And the deeper you are in Christ, the more you think about that, and you start thinking, well, what can we do? What can I do? And what have you done in the years since that incident on the bus?
Well, it's been a whirlwind. For a while when I did become a Christian, I told God, I'm not going to be your poster child. I told him, I'm not going to be your poster child for this. And I went about my life, and I started feeling very heavy once again that I wasn't doing what the Father wanted. And so I started to minister to people. And believe it or not, my wife came to Christ a couple months later after we got back together. Then her mother, her sister, her other sister, their husbands, the grandchildren who are now adults with their own families. So many people came to know the Lord, and I began speaking out where I was at work. And many people called me later on, years later, and said, you know what, your testimony is what made me search for the Lord, that I knew something wasn't wrong in my life. And to this day, I'm a worship leader. I've been a worship leader for over 20 years. I'm a chaplain for a professional hockey team.
Wow.
And now I'm going around speaking at conferences, men's conferences on demonology and prehistory and how to know Jesus more, and that breaking the stratagems of the evil one, since that is something I'm very, very familiar with living.
Well, indeed, your story really starts with demonology and with evil, and that you totally misunderstood. In other words, you didn't have the information, the capability at that age and at that time to really understand what was going on. But in retrospect, now you know that Satan and his minions are real, and I
Yes.
think that needs to be emphasized in a way. I think people really need to understand that the dark side is real. It's not just a fiction.
Yeah, and I know now that I was the target because God often reveals his plans and then the devil does his counter move, as L.A. Marzulli always says, you know.
Yes.
And that's what happened. I knew I was the target because he knew that I was going to come to him at sometime in the future, and I was going to help lead people to Christ, help people see their sin and a need for Jesus, for the redemption, of the blood of Christ to cover your sins. And that's what I've been doing since day one. And I'm, even though I still have the scars of my PTSD, which I still do severely bad, I have a really hard time at night sleeping. I have to take medications and things this because I get shakes and shudders and stuff like this. But I have joy in my heart. I don't have depression. I went through depression for about 18 years, was suicidal, was in lockdown at Loma Linda. I mean, the details go on and on and on and on. And the fight goes on and on and on, But I am so joyful. I have no fear of the enemy. And I'm a front line guy. I'll run to the front line and fight for Jesus because I know there's no one stronger than him, and you can't lose being on his side. So,
Again, let's suppose that you're sitting with someone right now who is cynical about Christ. And by the way, that is sort of the prevailing attitude about Christ. Okay, some people have the born again experience and it's okay for them, but I don't need it. And then you look at them and you say, well, listen, you've just been telling me about this, this, and this in your life, that some negative stuff, and I'm offering you the solution. And the guy says, no, I don't need that stuff. How do you deal with that from your perspective?
well, I would deal with that the way I dealt with it, because your intellect will soon wear out. Your youth of a young man, just like it says, the young lions run and they get tired. Your youth will wear out. Your intellect will wear out, and sooner or later you'll be in possession of a situation that is overwhelming and beyond your control. And like they said, there's no atheists in a foxhole.
How
You know,
true.
that's right. And God will put you there and give you the opportunity to yell out and cry out to him. And most people, I would say, that I've talked to, they respond to that. And it might not be for years later because, we're just farmers. We're sowing the seeds. We're sowing the seeds, and something you say today it might hit them 25 years from now. But to all the things that you rely on and lean upon, like a chair and all that, your intellect, your strength, all of those will soon fade and disappear, and you will find yourself in a situation that your intellect, your strength, your ability to negotiate life will be beyond your comprehension. And that is a guarantee because everybody is placed in that situation, because that's where Christ comes in. He shows you your humanity and your weakness because we are strong in him. Everything that we have will fail and will fade. And people seem to gravitate, they understand that precept.
They do indeed. And your story begins with a very dark side. And you mentioned our mutual friend, L.A. Marzulli. And L.A. has written and produced DVDs, and we've interviewed him many times. And L.A. understands the reality of the dark side, the power of it. And he's interviewed people, in some cases who have a story much like yours, and he strives to bring that out into the public where it can be understood and people can benefit from some of the dark stories that occur, the back stories, if you will, and the things you really don't hear in church, if you know what I mean. But I think your testimony is going to reach a lot of people.
I hope so, because I finally told the Lord that I will be your poster boy.
Very good. I love it. I love it. And so where do you think your life's going to take you from here? Do you study Bible prophecy, for example, and are you looking for the Lord's return? And how do you deal with all of the tumult in today's society and the strangeness, the things that are happening?
Well, I have such joy. I mean, if most people that meet me know that I have a lot of joy, and that only comes from being from so far on the left-hand side in the darkness, that I have so much more to be grateful for. I have seen the pit. I have been in the pit. And now that I've been raised from it, I'm so much more grateful. The Bible tells us that to him that has much to be forgiven is much grateful. And that's me. And I'm excited for what's going on in the world. I'm excited that Jesus is coming back. I have no fear. I have no fear of the future. I have no fear of dying. I have no fear of any of those things. And my hope is living in my heart. I am the living testimony of Jesus Christ and what he does with men. So I have no fear. And I love to tell people that, I bet you anything, you have tons of fears. You're uneasy about where this world and life is going.
Well, you speak a truth there. As we look at the world today, international politics, international economies, artificial intelligence, all kinds of scientific stratagems, that threaten to take over society and totally change the lives that we've had up to now, basically in the name of controlling the planet. And they offer the solution, if we can control the planet, we'll just have peace and prosperity and everybody will be happy and so forth. And you and I look at what's happening and then we read Bible prophecy and we say, ooh, all this looks entirely too familiar to me, And yet what you said really resounds with me. You have no fear. And you just said that very plainly. You who have come out of a life of fear.
Yes.
That's amazing.
And I had great fear. I couldn't even talk on the phone. I couldn't even talk on the phone. But, Gary, I live by this motto that if God is for me, who can be against me? So I don't fear death. I don't fear man. I fear God. And that's the beginning of understanding. And once we understand that God is for you, no one can be against you. So what is there? Why so downcast my soul? The future looks bright.
I love your message, and I am going to be praying for you that he'll send many people your way who can hear your story. Because I think your story, of coming out of absolute darkness into the light in the back of a bus, pardon me, but I just have to smile at that. Yeah. Even though it was a horrific moment in your life, it's a joy to see that moment of change. And I'm really glad you shared that with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. There's never a time where in fact, I haven't given my testimony for 20 or 30 years because I didn't think anybody cared.
I didn't
think
anybody
me. Cared.
People care.
People started telling me, you got a Paul of Tarsus type of testimony. I said, really? Okay. So, okay. I'll tell people then, I was an eyewitness to it. I was there, and I'll tell you, I've never been the same since that day. 1 minute I was one man, the next minute I was a different man, a new creation. I didn't know what kind of creation, but as I found out, everything was confirmed for me, which is the fascinating thing, because I would have never accepted another man's opinion. telling me this is what you need to do, I would have never accepted that. So God said, okay, I'm going to deal with you myself, and I'm going to do this. So, and I'm glad he did.
Well, Michael, may the Lord speed your work and open doors for you to bring your resounding testimony to many other people.
Amen.
And
Amen.
it's been great talking to you, and praise the Lord indeed. Michael Gagliardi, did I get that right? And I hope to talk to you again soon sometime.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Greetings from the Prophecy Watchers podcast. I'm Karen, and I have a great suggestion that will put you on the path to be a Bible prophecy expert. Have you heard about our monthly magazine, The Prophecy Watcher? For a limited time, you can become a subscriber to either the print or the digital version of the magazine and receive 10 cutting-edge bonus DVDs. Just visit our website at prophecywatchers.com or click on the link in the description to see what God has planned for your future, straight from the pages of the Bible.